to National Association of Scholars webinar series on American innovation. Today, our topic is the steamboat and the age of industry. My name is Matthew Schulte, and I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Steamship Historical Society of America. I'll be moderating today's event. In just a moment, you'll hear from our panelists, but first, I wanted to give you an idea of what to expect from today's event. After I introduce our speakers, they'll each have about 12 to 14 minutes to speak. At the conclusion of their remarks, I'll read questions from you, the audience, to our panelists. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during the event. If your questions don't get answered, you can always send them to NAS at Randall, that's RANDALL, at nas.org, and they'll be forwarded to the panelists. The event will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to the email address that you registered for. Thank you very much for joining us for this event, and without further delay, please allow me to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Kevin Chrisman is professor in the Nautical Archaeology program at Texas A&M and the director of the Center for Maritime Archaeology and Conservation. Dr. Chrisman specializes in world seafaring from 1400 to the present and teaches courses in New World seafaring, post-medieval European seafaring, and historical archaeology. He has directed or participated in the underwater investigation of numerous shipwrecks. Dr. Chrisman's publications include The Eagle, an American brig on Lake Champlain during the War of 1812, and When Horses Walked on Water, horse-powered ferries in the 19th century America. Dr. Robert Goodmanstead is Associate Professor of History at Colorado State University, where he specializes in the history of the American South, particularly the Civil War, steamboats, and American slavery. He's the author of two books, Steamboats and the Rise of the Cotton Kingdom, and A Troublesome Commerce, the Transformation of the Interstate Slave Trade. And Dr. Paul Johnston is Curator of Maritime History at Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. His research focuses on maritime history, archaeology, and shipwrecks. He's on the editorial advisory board of the Nautical Research Journal and has published numerous books and book chapters on underwater archaeology, maritime museums, and shipwrecks. He has also edited 3 volumes of the annual ACUA Underwater Archaeology Proceedings. Welcome all. And now let's move forward, and Dr. Chrisman, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm going to put up a few slides here, and I'm an archaeologist, a maritime archaeologist, and in archaeology, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it's we're a very visually based branch of the social sciences, and so I'm going to share with you a few images as we go forward here. Let's see here. Let me turn this into a slideshow. Thank you very much, Matt, again, and also I just want to say how pleased I am to be invited by the National Association of Scholars to participate in this event, and also to be in such august company as Dr. Goodmanstead and Dr. Johnston. And I thought in my segment here, I would share some of the background of my research in steamboats, and then wrap up with a few observations of I've learned along the way of steamboats, and hopefully these will be points of discussion in our subsequent open forum. So as Dr. Schultz said, I'm associated with the Texas A&M University in their Nautical Archaeology graduate program. I'm also associated with the Institute of Nautical Archaeology based at Texas A&M, and I've been lucky to be able to investigate steamboats and steamboat archaeology since I got started in this field. When I was still an undergraduate, I participated in 1980 in the study of what is still the earliest wreck of a steamboat, the Phoenix. I'll talk about that some more in just a moment. Most of my career has been spent on Lake Champlain. And this is not the most widely known of North American lakes. It's the Ungreat Lake. It's the one off to the east of the Great Lakes between Vermont and New York that drains northward into Quebec, and it's only about 120 miles long and 12 miles wide at its widest point. So it's not terribly large, but it's a terrific place to study the development of inland steam navigation. Lake Champlain was an early part of the steamboat revolution, and continued in right up to the beginning of the 20th century to add steamboats to its fleet. Over the course of Lake Champlain's history, a total of 29 were built. And here you see them laid out in a timeline. This is between 1809, when the first steamboat Vermont was built, up to 1905, when the last steamboat Ticonderoga was built. That of course is still in existence today at Shelburne Museum. The great thing about Lake Champlain is that it preserves its freshwater preserves wrecks really well. And of these 29 steamboats, we have been able to locate 12 of them, which I think is pretty amazing. And what's even better from my point of view is that of those 12, 6 of them are the early steamboats, and to the left there of the dashed line that predate 1850, which I consider kind of a cutoff point, because after that we start to get good photographs of steamboats and also a lot more technical information on steamboats. But pre-1850, there ain't much out there, as an archaeologist, and particularly in kind of the nuts and bolts of steamboat operation. And that's where I really think where archaeology comes in, is kind of giving us the close-up view of the steamboat revolution in North America. So 6 of the lake's early steamboats have survived. The earliest wreck that is on the lake, and it's the earliest steamboat wreck known around the world, period, is Phoenix 1, which was built in 1815, which is just 8 years after Robert Fulton and Livingston, his colleague Livingston, launched the North River Steamboat of Claremont on the Hudson River. So this is an early entry into the steamboat revolution. Phoenix operated for 4 years, but unfortunately caught fire and burned in September of 1819. The loss of Phoenix was unfortunate for the people on board, particularly the 5 people who drowned. But it's been our great archaeological discovery. It was found in the late 1970s, and as I said, as an undergraduate, I studied it in 1980, the first recording of the hull. Archaeologists have since gone back under the direction of Dr. George Schwartz and restudied the wreck and gleaned much more information from it. And it really is a benchmark for us for understanding early steamboat design and construction. Unfortunately, the boiler and engines were recovered at the time of the sinking, because those would be really nice to get our hands on. But we did just find these. When Phoenix burned in 1819, the paddle wheels hanging off the sides of the wreck basically detached. Their weight broke them free of the wreck, and they fell to the bottom north of the present location of the wreck. They were found in 2020, just 2 years ago, and I just spent a lovely 2 weeks on these last month, trying to 3D record them using ROVs. They are a terrific archaeological find. So just really our discoveries continue constantly in North American steamboat archaeology. And just I thought I'd mention an ongoing project. We'll have more out about these shortly. The lake has produced many other wrecks, as I've said, and we spent 3 years studying a collection of 4 early steamers that are sunk in a steamboat graveyard. Here's a picture of the site around 1850, and then here we see where they are today. 4 steamboats. The earliest, number 2, is from 1820. The latest, number 1, is from 1870. So we've got this wonderful range of steamboat wrecks that we were able to glean a great deal of information from about steamboat design and construction on the lakes. And that was a subject of Dr. Carolyn Kennedy's doctoral dissertation here at Texas A&M. Matt mentioned the horse boats book. This was another find in Lake Champlain, which really opened our eyes to an alternative to steam, and that was the use of steam machinery, essentially paddle wheels and gears to put horses to work doing the same thing. And these were very popular as ferry boats. They are frequently mentioned in historical sources, but we found an intact or nearly intact one in Lake Champlain back in the 1980s. And this was studied and reconstructed. So we have plans and construction details of this early horse-powered version of steam propulsion. The cheap alternative, not so much enjoyed by horses, however. And finally, I just mentioned a more recent project that I've been working on the Western rivers of North America. This is really Dr. Goodmestad's area of specialization, but I was fortunate enough to kind of fall into a very interesting project here. Now, the Western rivers were really the prime location for steamboat operations. It was recognized by Robert Fulton and others that this was the place that steamboats would really be of immense service, and this proved to be the case. The Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, and their many tributaries brought about the construction of initially hundreds and later thousands of steamboats for operations in the center of the country. And again, not a lot is known about the early examples, but one example, or what's still the earliest known example of a Western River type steamboat, was found in southeastern Oklahoma, along the border of Texas in the Red River in 1999. I was fortunate enough to work with Oklahoma archaeologists to study this wreck in the early 2000s. Here you see it during a period of low water. This was kind of an amphibious operation. But we were able to excavate the entire wreck, record details of the hull, and also recover, and this was kind of fun, we recovered a lot of machinery. They recovered the original sinking, saw the recovery of the boilers, but they left behind pieces of them, and they left essentially the whole drivetrain, so we could study how these things worked. This was the steamboat Heroine, built in 1832 and lost in 1838, and down below is a reconstruction model showing what Heroine likely looked like at the time of its sinking, as a very typical example. And as I said, this is really our earliest look at a Western River steamboat archaeologically. The boiler and paddle wheel machinery remnants allowed us to reconstruct with some degree of confidence the arrangement of the machinery, which you see here in a model. And we, as a result of this, have a much better idea how these worked, and also just how dangerous they were. So a few wrap-up thoughts here in my introduction, and that is one of the features of early steam, which has really fascinated me, is the fact that the design and assembly techniques evolved very quickly and diversified very quickly. They realized that the earlier styles didn't really work on, what worked on the Hudson River didn't necessarily work on the Great Lakes or the Western rivers, and so there was kind of an organic process of development that was taking place in the early decades that didn't really get documented. They were kind of flying by the seat of their pants, and keeping records was not part of the package. And so this is where archaeology really comes in. We can study these wrecks on the bottom and get a much better sense of how they were designed and built, and what life was like on board them. Another very obvious result of our studies is to get a sense of how much steam really jump-started the growth of North American iron and steel industries. Here you see the Novelty Iron Works in New York City. Operations like this sprang up all over North America to support the construction of steam engines. And like the building of the boats, this was much more of an art than a science. Very clearly, they were kind of, again, feeling their way along as they went with these machine shops, kind of tweaking designs, coming up with a slightly better alternative the next time. This was really very much of an artistic endeavor, much more of that than I would have expected for building these kinds of boats. The result was too, these were very dangerous boats. They blew up all the time. They had frequent breakdowns, and their failures in the early decades really led to what was considered the first major U.S. public safety crisis. This was addressed in an address by Andrew Jackson in the early 1830s about the problems that had to be overcome to make steamboats safe for the public. Finally, I just conclude that these boats really transformed the American public. It's so clear, and really the world in the process. They really altered the sense of time and distance. All of a sudden, going a few hundred miles in a few days wasn't outlandish, wasn't crazy, and was very doable. It was actually very comfortable. These boats were also the great meeting place of the American public in a way that had not really existed before. You would find on a typical Western River steamboat, there might be slaves or enslaved people being carried on the lower deck. There were migrants coming from Europe, also on the lower deck. There might be European princes or wealthy people. There might be Western trappers and mountain men. They all traveled on these boats. They all got to know each other up close and personal during the times that they passed up and down the rivers. And it was a way that the American public really got introduced to each other, the North and the South, the freed and the enslaved, the local and the foreigner. They all rubbed shoulders on these boats, and it really was a place where the melting pot idea of American society really melted. So I will, with those thoughts, I will step out of my introductory portion here and turn the podium over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chrisman. That's a wonderful way to set the stage here. And so people have the context. Remember, this predates the rail era in this country. So those of you joining us, this is so important that we have this foundation. And now, Dr. Goodbiston. Oh, your microphone, Doc.
All right, sorry about that. All right, I got ahead of myself. I was saying it's always a great day when we can talk about steamboats. So that was a great introduction, and I'm going to talk mainly about the influence of steamboats in what was then the American West, but particularly the southern part of the United States, the lower Mississippi River Valley. And in a lot of ways, steamboats were a solution to a variety of problems. And so to understand why steamboats were so influential, you have to understand really what came before them. And you have flatboats and keelboats when you're looking at river transportation primarily. And so this is a kind of a hazy drawing of the two. And so the flatboat is at the bottom of the screen, and they were relatively small. You can see kind of that was a good proportional size there. If you look at the individuals, thinking they're about 5.5 or 6 feet tall, they were one-way vessels. They were built, say, in Kentucky, and you would have 5 or 6 people on a flatboat. They would float literally down the river. You had the long oars that were called sweeps. And once you got to your destination, which was very often New Orleans, because you were trying to sell your produce in New Orleans or your products or whatever it happened to be, and New Orleans was obviously connected with national and international markets, you would break up the flatboat and you would either walk back home or you would take a horse back home. You'd buy a horse and ride back home. And so it's obviously a cumbersome process, even by the standards of the day. But in 1810, 90% of all river traffic in the West was on flatboats. And it's downstream traffic because going upstream in a keelboat, which you can see in the second part of that drawing, was much, much more difficult. Keelboats, you can see, are of a different design. They're not really meant to float as much as the flatboat did. They have more of a hull in them, and so they sink a little bit deeper into the water, and they are propelled by the individuals. And this is actually a really good representation of how they went upstream. So you've got individuals on each side who had long poles, and they would stick those poles into the water so that they got into the bed of the river, and then they would push against them. And so literally they're kind of walking in place and using their legs to push the boat upriver. So you're going against in this case, the Mississippi's current, which was a strong current, especially the further south you get. And so if you're going to travel from New Orleans to Louisville, you're looking at a 3 to 4 month trip. You're covering, maybe 10 miles in a day of just brutally exhausting work. And of course, these boats aren't very big either, because they can't be big, because you're limited in terms of where you can sort of really push upstream by human power. So a typical year prior to 1810, keelboats would be able to transport about 6,500 tons of cargo per year. So that's all of the keelboats going upstream the Mississippi. By 1820, steamboats could do that in 2 weeks. And really, it's not an exaggeration to say that steamboats were revolutionary, particularly on these Western rivers. And as I came to believe in doing the research for my book, steamboats became the workhorse of the plantation regime, as you can see on that slide. And it's conventional wisdom, and it's certainly not incorrect that the cotton gin was an important change for the production of cotton in the United States, because it fixed a problem, so to speak, of separating the seeds out of the cotton. But I believe that steamboats also fixed a problem, if you will, for cotton plantations and other plantations in the South, and it's this transportation problem. And so if that colored picture, to me, just when I see it, always amazes me. As you can see from the caption, that's the steamboat TP Leathers. Leathers owned several boats out of Natchez before and after the American Civil War, but that's loaded with 4,000 bales of cotton. Now that's fairly normal for an average to a little bit larger than average Mississippi River steamboat, because boats had a fairly narrow keel, if you will, but they had the guards, and those are the flat portions of the boat, and you can actually see them. There was a really good representation of that in one of Kevin's slides from the heroine. You could see the guards over the keel, but so the guards become the place where you can stack all of this cargo, and a bale of cotton was about the size of a refrigerator and weighed about 600 to 700 pounds. So you get a sense for the magnitude of how much material that you can carry on one of these steamboats. And I'll just give you a couple of figures, and I don't want to have death by statistics, but in 1816, steamboats brought about 37,000 bales of cotton to New Orleans. That's 1816. In 1840, it's 923,000 bales. So we go from 37,000 to 923,000. And it wasn't just cotton. It's basically anything that you can think of shipping. And so one way to think about steamboats are, yes, they, as Kevin pointed out, they're moving passengers, certainly, but they're also moving so much freight. It's almost like the Amazon truck that you see in your neighborhood, that it's ubiquitous. It's steamboats are constantly on the rivers, and they're constantly making stops, either taking freight on, taking freight off, and passengers on and off. And in any given year in the West, you have anywhere from 700 to 1,000 steamboat, or excuse me, in a decade, you have anywhere from 700 to 1,000 steamboats built. They averaged about 250 tons, and cost around $20,000 to build, which at the time, I wouldn't say it was affordable, but it was certainly within reach of limited liability companies. And that picture on the bottom right are roustabouts from the time of the Civil War. That's probably after the Civil War. I wish I was strong enough to put a hog on my shoulder, but the point being that, again, you could ship just about anything on these steamboats. And so as steamboats are so important to the development, if you will, and the thirst for cotton in the pre-Civil War South, they accelerate the desire to have more land so you can grow more cotton. Well, that changes where people live and how people live in the United States. And as you can see, it accelerated the forced migration of indigenous people and enslaved people. So let me talk about first enslaved people. Obviously, plantations are one of the important economic drivers of the antebellum South, and you have enslaved people on those plantations. And so you have this forced migration of enslaved people from the Chesapeake area into areas like Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama to work on these, to be forced to work on these plantations. Now, this would have happened anyway, but my argument is that steamboats accelerated the process because they make land more valuable, because cotton is more valuable because you can ship so much more of it. Now, and so you can, there's a correlation here. So you can see the cotton production there on the map on the left, but much of the land that becomes known as the Black Belt was prime land where indigenous people lived in the early 1800s. And so there's enormous pressure by whites in the American South to get these indigenous people out of that land. And it's a process that we normally call Indian removal. And so steamboats not only accelerated Indian removal, but they were used in Indian removal. And research that I've done, when you look at the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes, over 70% and usually up in the upper 80% of Native Americans who were removed during this time, and you can see that on the map on the slide, went all or part of the way to Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma, on a steamboat, because it was relatively cheap, relatively fast, and the government could charter them. Cherokees were the least likely group of people to be moved on a steamboat because the rivers were so low when their forced migration took place after they lost their court case during Andrew Jackson's presidency. Only about 20% of Cherokees were moved via steamboat. John Ross was one of them, probably the most famous Cherokee. These were disease-ridden, they were unsanitary. Native Americans were packed into coal boats and barges and towed behind steamboats. They were overcrowded. And the largest maritime disaster prior to the Sultana, which took place at the end of the American Civil War, was the sinking of the Monmouth in 1837. It was part of this removal of Native Americans. It's a story that most Americans have no idea about. If you will, the official figure is 311 people died. It was a crash. It was dark. It was about 20 miles north of New Orleans. And apparently the crew had been drinking. They are in the wrong part of the channel. And there's a crash and the steamboat breaks in half and it sinks. I also believe that steamboats influenced the growth of railroads, and I'll try to speed up here, especially in the antebellum South. And if you look at the map, in large part, in some ways, there's not a real need to build a lot of steamboats in the lower Mississippi River Valley because to build railroad tracks, because you're using steamboats. And if you look at those railroads, especially in the South, just north of New Orleans, very often they are connected to steamboat landings. So that one that's going east-west in New Orleans and in Mississippi, those are tied into steamboats. And if you look at the north, you can see that there's so many more railroads because you don't have this river system. And so up to the Civil War in the antebellum South, steamboats are a more important mode of transportation than railroads are. And I argue that in a lot of ways, you get more of a unification of the Northern economy because Northerners are less likely in the 1850s to send their commerce down the Mississippi River and more likely to send it east because of the railroad network that's built in the antebellum North. Now, they're still sending stuff down the river, but what I'm saying is commerce is being diverted to the northeastern part of the United States. And by the way, it takes until 1883 before railroads bring more freight to New Orleans than steamboats. And so finally, my current research is about steamboats during the American Civil War, and especially in the Western Theater. And I'm going to argue that steamboats were crucial to Union victory. If you think about all of the early battles in the American Civil War in the Western Theater, they take place along rivers. That's not coincidental because these rivers are avenues of invasion for the Union armies. So you think about Shiloh, it's along a river. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Island Number 10, they're all along rivers. You're trying to take Vicksburg, it's along a river. New Orleans, it's along a river. I think you get the point. Steamboats became crucially important to the Union Army for transporting supplies. An Ohio River steamboat, like we saw in some of those earlier slides, could carry enough freight. So one steamboat could carry enough freight to feed an army of about 60,000 men for a day and a half. So that's feeding the men and feeding the horses. You need basically like 3 railroads to do the same thing. So the Union charters or buys hundreds and hundreds of these steamboats, and they are at work along the rivers going back and forth, bringing supplies to the Union Army. And also the Union, as you can see, built a fleet of armored boats for the Western Theater. On the left, you have, of course, the famous Cairo, which sank. It was sunk by a torpedo, which we would call a mine. You can see the remnants of it at the Vicksburg Military Park. And then you have a lighter craft called they were tinclads. That's the USS Rattler. But the Union built 101 fighting boats as part of this fleet on the Western rivers. It's the Western Gunboat Flotilla or the Mississippi Squadron, and they had 26 service craft. This fleet, by the end of the Civil War, is as large as the largest blue water fleet, which is the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And at least 16,000 men served on this fleet during the course of the American Civil War. So it is a large operation. And the fleet is crucial to these early victories in the West. And Grant it's very difficult for Grant to take Vicksburg without the help of the Union Navy. That's a whole nother story. I'm out of time. I'm a little breathless, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
That's awesome. Thank you so much with that. I mean, one of the things we have here at the Steamship Historical Society is 3 themes: immigration, trade, and leisure. And you tied in all those and add in the military aspect and war. And that takes us right to where we are today, too. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Johnston to take it from here.
Well, I want to thank my predecessors, Kevin and Robert, for giving the background that allows me the leisure to actually show some of the highlights from our steamboat heritage at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Can you see that first picture up on the screen there? Okay, great. What we're looking at is actually John Fitch's November 1791 patent for his duck-legged steamboat. Now, this is the French patent. We don't have the American patent. The American Patent Office, the Patent and Trademark Office burned up a lot of the early patents, and they actually had to come back to the Smithsonian, which had some of the original patents still on file to get the old records. But this is the French patent, and you'll notice at the top of the picture that there's a water stain there. And I kind of don't want to do the research on that because this is the French patent. And the French patent had a fire in the late 19th century. And I'm wondering if maybe this was not water damaged and either discarded or thrown out. I don't want to know because it might be one of those things that we'd have to return. Another real true gem highlight is the logbook of the very first steamship that ever set across the Atlantic in May of 1818. It left from Savannah, Georgia, and that's why it was called the Savannah, although the engine was built in New York. It was distinguished by the fact that there were about half a dozen owners, and the whole concept of steamships crossing the Atlantic in 1818 was so novel and bizarre that not a single one of the half dozen owners would travel on the ship. Not a single one put a single ounce of cargo on board that ship either. So it went completely empty of everything except enough wood to leave Savannah with a little bit of wood to show that she was a steamboat coming into Liverpool, England. And the reason that we have National Maritime Day is May 22nd is because that's the day that in 1818, May 22nd, that Savannah left Savannah Harbor. So that's the event for National Maritime Day. What happened to the ship? It wrecked. Owners tried to sell it in Europe, failed miserably. They went up to the Baltic, tried to sell it to the Russians. The Russians were interested, but didn't decide to buy it. So Savannah came all the way back to New York, and they tried to then come down to Washington, D.C., down the Potomac, tried to sell it to the U.S. Navy. Again, it was such a novel idea, so bizarre and ahead of its time, the Navy wouldn't buy it either. So Savannah went back to New York and spent the rest of its life without an engine. They took the engine out of it and used it as a sailing ship in Long Island Sound, just a merchant cargo ship, and it wrecked there. So the wreck of the first steamboat across the Atlantic is there as well. And I think that the logbook is actually covered in sailcloth from the earlier phase of the ship. It's very, very heavy canvas, but I don't have any way really of proving that, unfortunately. Another highlight, we talked about the Mississippi River earlier, is Abraham Lincoln's patent model. Abraham Lincoln was the only American president to take out a patent, and he generated the idea in the 1840s. He actually had a maritime background. He and a friend of his took 2 voyages down the Mississippi River with a local farmer's produce and sold the produce in New Orleans and the raft timbers, and then made their way back up and then did the same thing again the next summer. And he made a patent model. When you can see there are floats down along the bottom here. These are silk covered. And the concept was to push down on these poles and float the boat over the shoal waters. Kind of a nutty idea. Let's just say that Abraham Lincoln's talents, considerable talents, lay elsewhere, without saying what a terrible idea this was. But he actually visited the patent model with his son when he was president, right in Washington, D.C., in what is now the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. That was the original patent office. And in 1908, we were given free rein. We were given the option to cherry pick the entire collection of patent models that were at the patent office, because they were getting rid of models. We got about 10,000 models. But people say, well, what's your favorite thing? And I'm like, well, if there were a fire, I'd try to get the Lincoln model under one arm and the Fitch patent under the other arm, and then run outside the building. In the 1970s, the Smithsonian went up to Lake Superior and recovered the engine, the boiler, and the propulsion system from one of the very earliest propeller steamboats in the United States, the Indiana. Indiana was built in 1848 in Vermilion, Ohio, just a little bit to the west of Cleveland. And I knew the state archaeologist from Michigan. He said, well, why don't you come up here and finish the job and document the shipwreck? So seemed like a pretty good idea at the time. I also am an underwater archaeologist. So in the early 90s, we went up to, in fact, Kevin Chrisman was one of our divers one summer. We went up to find well, we didn't find the regular steamboat. We worked on the regular steamboat. And you can see here the propeller shaft. The propeller itself was cut off. And you can see right here, there's quite a large cut. This is the globe, and probably pretty much what Indiana looked like. And the location of the Indiana here, right off Crisp Point near Sault Ste. Marie, connection point between the Great Lakes. So we recovered the engine and boiler, and those are off-site and off-site storage. They're over 14 feet high, and our ceilings are only 14 feet, so we couldn't display them. But you can see here exactly what happened to the ship. One of the blades of the propeller broke loose and put this wicked cut in the stern post and literally shivered the ship's timbers. This gap here was caused by the whack that the propeller made and knocked it open. The ship sank. There were 17 crew on board, including the owner, and they all managed to get to shore without any problem. But in the late 70s and early 80s, before I was at the Smithsonian recovered the propeller. And you can see here, we mounted it on the wall, and it was actually turning. When they mounted on the wall in 1984, it was turning. The bit outboard of this blade here, that line shows a reconstruction. So it was actually turning, and it turned about 2 million times. And I was at a conference in Florida, as a matter of fact, an underwater archaeology conference, and I got a call from a colleague saying that the propeller had fallen off the wall. And you can see here, it's lying on the ground. It actually had one more accident while I was away. This was actually the day after the Secretary of the Navy came to see it. And it's a good thing he came a day early, because he might have been whacked by the propeller as it was grinding. What happened was that we had a modern propeller shaft made out of very high tensile steel, but when the original mount was made, an electric arc jumped across the gap of the modern oops, got to go back one, of the modern propeller shaft. And in the course of 2 million revolutions, it actually weakened the joint enough for the propeller to break off. You can see there, right there is where the break took place. And I have, as a souvenir, a piece of that break. We had some metal fatigue engineers working at the Smithsonian as volunteers, and they figured all this out and wrote up a report on it. It's absolutely fascinating. But we no longer rotate the propeller, over my objection. But other sorts of things we have for steamboats, we have a lot of Atlantic steamboat material. This is the lantern or skylight from the first class lounge of the transatlantic ocean liner Majestic. And over here, a little bit to the right, is a more modern piece from the SS United States, which was an all aluminum ocean liner, which had the blue ribbon of the Atlantic. It was built in the 1950s and decommissioned in the 1960s, and now sits in Philadelphia Harbor, waiting for someone to do something with it. Probably will be converted into a hotel if it's not too expensive. And then down below, we have a large Bassett and Lauk model from the Cunard Line's lobby. They used to be on the Fifth Avenue in New York, had all their great, magnificent steamship models there. And when they closed those, they donated the models to Mystic, the Smithsonian, the Peabody Museum, anyone dumb enough to take a giant model almost 20 feet long and keep it for posterity. We have quite a lot of Titanic material too. This is one of the very last photographs taken of Titanic. And we had a whole notebook, including the original telegram that notified Titanic to the mainland, notifying them that there was a wreck, but that was stolen back in the 1970s. So a lot of what we have are reproductions, but this is an original photo. I thought it was the last photo taken, but apparently there are a couple that were taken a minute or two earlier, and they can tell from the shoreline where the ship was. I'm trying to go to the next slide and it's not cooperating. Let's see if I can get it to move. There we go. We have a life vest from Titanic. Lots of sheet music, over 3 dozen pieces of sheet music. Of course, it's the people, as soon as the wreck happened, people were trying to exploit it. One of the most interesting objects we have is a camera from little Bernie Palmer, who got the camera when she was she doesn't remember. It was either given to her in Christmas 1912 or her birthday, which was in January 1912. But she and her mom took a trip on Carpathia. They were planning to go over to Croatia, actually, in the Mediterranean. But as soon as they were out of New York, they got the distress call from Titanic. And so, of course, they went right to Titanic. They shut down all the hot water to the passengers, shut down all the showers, put all power on for Titanic, got there a couple of hours after the ship sank. But Bernie took pictures of the survivors of Titanic and also the only known picture of the iceberg of Titanic. And she sold those pictures to, that. First of all, Carpathia came back to New York. They didn't figure that they had enough food for all of the 700 passengers that they picked up from Titanic. So they came right back to New York and debarked the Titanic survivors. No one was allowed on the ship. All the press was all interested. No one was allowed on the ship until that had happened. And a press aggregator came on the ship, bought Bernie's photos for $10, said, "I'll give you $10 for the pictures, and we'll give you prints." And she said, "Oh, okay, sure, that sounds fine." Well, I can imagine what her parents thought when they found that out. But anyway, they made a fortune. They sold pictures all over the world. And in 1985, when Bernie went into a rest home, she donated the camera, the contract with Underwood and Underwood, and those copies of all of the pictures that she had given. We also have some of the radio gear. These are Leyden jars, basically old batteries, and the telegraph from the Carpathia, the rescue ship, which was making signals all the way back to the mainland. And the mechanic who went aboard Carpathia to fix the radio saved these parts of the radio as souvenirs. The famous missing Archibald Gracie statue. We're missing a 9-foot statue that was on exhibit in the Smithsonian in our museum until the 1970s, from the 1930s to the 1970s. Then it was crated and taken off site, and we're still looking for that. We haven't seen it. So that's part of the story to be continued. So I too am out of time. So let me just invite you to come to our maritime exhibit at the Smithsonian. All of our exhibits are online almost as soon as they go up. This one is called On the Water, where these and many of the other artifacts are visible for display. And I too will join Kevin and Robert in offering to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
That's awesome, Paul. Thanks so much for that. And it brings things right into the 20th century, not only with popular culture and relevance, but I think that who hasn't had a question about Titanic or wondering what the SSU United States is doing in Philadelphia today. But let's pull it all together here. And let me ask the group of you with this kind of basis now for where we are in this wonderful overview. How did all this, in a sense, really impact individual people? Obviously, the innovation we're talking about, the technology, and the wonderful acronym of STEAM today of science, technology, engineering, art, math. But how can we put it in perspective? Who were the key figures, and how did this really move America forward?
I just was going to mention that one of the avenues I've been pursuing in studying the wrecks of the Phoenix and the Heroine with colleagues is that there's a lot of academic effort has been spent on the early developers of steam like Fulton, but I really think that the interesting area is the people who followed in their wake and took steam to the commercial level, made it work. And in both the cases of those steamboats, the principal movers were middle-aged men who had been working in other areas and saw this as a great economic opportunity. And I think there also was kind of for them midlife crises, but they invested heavily in steam and kind of made it their life's mission in the second half of their lives. The owner of the Heroine built and owned over 20 years, over a dozen steamboats. The builder of Phoenix was active on Lake Champlain for his entire career until he died in 1844. And it's these people I think are particularly interesting to see how, where they came from and what motivated them to jump into this new technology. And it's hard not to draw some analogies with automobiles in the early 20th century or obviously computers in the late 20th century. There's a period of development which tends to be our focus, but in fact the interesting stuff often happens when it kind of moves out into the wider population and you have multiple individuals all following their own ideas of where this technology should go. So just mention that in passing.
That's interesting because the owners of Indiana also were middle-aged men. I'd never really thought of that, but it's interesting to make a connection between midlife crisis, whereas now somebody might buy a Corvette or something like that. Here they were jumping into steamboats.
They had the resources.
Yeah, and they had the resources because they were middle-aged. Yeah, sure. Now, for real steam, though, I mean, Robert was talking about how they developed the railroad, but in fact, the railroad turned around and gobbled up all of the steamboats, really, to a very large extent, because so much of our country really is terrestrial. It's not maritime. But the other thing you got to remember, even today, is that over 90% of all of the cargo that's transported around the world is carried on ships. Now, they're not steamboats, but nevertheless, they're transported all over the world. Almost everything we consume in every way is carried aboard a container ship. So maritime enterprise remains today as, if not more important than in the past. Of course, we don't see it because all of the ports are so secure. You can't even put petroleum port into Google and get an answer. That they're locked down so tight. I was trying to find out if one particular ship had ever even been in the United States, because we had a model of it. It took me a couple of months, even as a civil servant, to get an answer out of the Coast Guard that yes, it had made at least one journey to the United States, which meant that I could put it in the exhibit of American history. So you can't get into any of the ports now to see what's going on or be affected by it, even though it's fascinating because of the security involved. So you can't really talk too much about it except in the abstract sense.
Robert,
Yeah, I was going to add that, the progress for some is not progress for others, because the question that you asked was sort of about progress in moving America forward. It certainly helped with immigrants going to New Orleans, the steamboats did, because they could then buy a relatively cheap deck passage and move their belongings and then be able to go to somewhere, along a tributary. And one English observer wrote it that they were domestic atlases with their world upon their shoulders as they migrated north along the river. And it's the connection to not just things but also communication, especially in the West. Steamboats are important before the telegraph for carrying newspapers and for carrying news relatively quickly. And I found a reference. There was basically a kind of a log in Natchez that recorded steamboats as they stopped there, and then they would also kind of record the news as well, or they'd brag about what they'd been doing. And there were references to the banks are all stopped here, and as the panic of 1837 went in, you could see that news is being purveyed or spread through steamboats. But also, steamboats have winners and losers. And as I alluded to in my presentation, enslaved people are transported on steamboats as part of the domestic slave trade. They're in chains, and sometimes they're chained onto the deck of the boat. The indigenous Americans are transported by and large to, out of profitable areas on steamboats, and partly because of steamboats. It makes some people very, very wealthy as well. And then, finally, there were people though who were able to sort of see things a different way and use steamboats, at least on the Mississippi River system, in very interesting and profitable ways. I mean, you hear stories about gamblers where there were gamblers on these steamboats. There were circus boats, and so these steamboats also become entertainment. So these circus boats are going from town to town, and also wood yards became sort of an equivalent of a gas station, because these steamboats burned enormous amounts of wood, and they wanted to move very quickly. And so instead of chopping down trees, they would stop at a wood yard where the wood had already been chopped. Now you've got someone who's basically an entrepreneur, and that's their job, to go chop down all the wood in the area and sell it to the steamboats. And so there's, the mention, I think, in Kevin's presentation about fueling these other industries like the iron and steel industry in the United States. That happens in a multitude of ways.
Yeah. I think too, along those same lines, the movement west is oftentimes overlooked, and the importance of the small steamboats and all the rivers. And everybody has the thought, we were taught in a certain time period about the Conestoga wagons, et cetera, but talk about a little bit about the westward movement and getting goods and services and people out there too.
We have some questions in the Q&A. I don't know if we want to move on to those or.
Yeah, I'll briefly address that, and then I'm also going to try to answer a question in the Q&A as well. Well, I can answer it live. One is I saw the Cairo when I was in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Where else could I see the ruins of other steamboats? There aren't many, at least when you're talking about Western River steamboats. There is the steamboat Bertrand which was found in Nebraska, and so there's a small museum. I can't remember where in Nebraska. I'm trying to look it up really quickly.
I think
or in
DeSoto
Iowa.
Bend National Museum or National Park. I forget.
National Park, yeah.
Yeah. And then there's it's not a wreck so much of a steamboat, but there's what I think is a good museum of the U.S. Of the Arabia in Kansas City, and it was a steamboat that was wrecked. And then this group of individuals, they thought they were going to find gold literally on the steamboat. They didn't find that, but they took the contents of the steamboat out, and they have basically built a museum about it and about what steamboats did. And in westward movement, if you will, because again, you could go, if you were in New Orleans and the river was right, you could go to Montana a certain part of the year, or you could get to Pittsburgh. That's a massive spread of geography in the United States. And so under certain conditions, you could get into South Dakota, you could get into Montana and other areas that we would consider the West, in Nebraska as well. And so you've got the movement of people and their possessions, but then also you've got the ability for those people to be able to buy products that you wouldn't necessarily have to have shipped overland, and also to be able to market their products, to sell them as well. And of course, you're acting by this point in concert with railroads. And so, there's this, railroads, as Paul pointed out, are become more important than steamboats by, the 1860s, in particular the 1870s.
There are also a couple of Confederate steamboats at the Confederate Naval Museum in Georgia. Those are not in terribly good shape, but those are both steamboats. I was looking for the town that's in it. I want to say Columbus.
I think that's correct, Paul.
I thought it was Columbus, Georgia, but I'm not.
Right, Columbus, Georgia. Sorry, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have pieces of the Indiana, the several pieces of the Indiana, including the propeller, on exhibit at the Smithsonian, of course.
And there are some, more contemporary holdouts or remnants, like the Delta King in California. That's a hotel now, to get some aspect of what that was like at the time. The couple of questions coming in from a research standpoint, wondering if any of you have used the records from such as the inspection service records or other things found from folks that were, let's see, at Snug Harbor and the museum there. Let's see.
I think
I've
Sailor
not.
Snug Harbor are at the John. Those records are at the John Noble Museum in Staten Island.
Right.
I haven't personally used them, but I know they exist. But I have not gotten down to that granular level of research personally.
Okay.
My experience for the early boats is that they, where you can find them, they're a wonderful tool to access. For instance, in Lake Champlain, we have records of many of the early steamboats. In the case of Western boats, there are some terrific enrollment records that you can use for getting dimensions and place of construction and so forth about Western River steamboats. But their preservation is uneven. The boats that worked out of Louisville, the records there seem to have mostly been destroyed. I could find nothing on heroin. But for other Western ports, some of those records are intact, and they're a wonderful tool. I've accessed those at the National Archives in Washington, and it's a great source of comparative data on early boats from the period of the heroin.
I'm wondering if any of the panelists have had any recent interactions with the organization, the Sons and Daughters of Pioneer Rivermen. They were one of the stalwarts going back decades, and I know we had some communication and contact with them and affiliation, but not of recent years. Any of
I
you?
haven't in 15 or 20 years. I'm wondering if they haven't just sort of vanished.
Yeah.
They're yeah, they're not active so much anymore, but there's a number of people who are active in that organization have a blog that I'm trying to find, that I've been on a few times and answered questions. And they seem to be somewhat affiliated with the Howard Steamboat Museum.
Incredibly knowledgeable when you get
Yeah,
through to one of them. They're just passionate, knowledgeable, very, very interesting people.
Mhm. Okay. All right. Well, that's being looked up. There was another question. It may be specific. I don't know too specific for us here, but did some of the ships and boats take on a steam turbine invented by Parson, whose family home is in Burr County in Ireland? Anyone have any?
Yeah, the answer is yes. That was primarily a military application, but there were a couple of commercial vessels, again, a little bit ahead of its time. That was a very, very late 19th century invention. Parsons was, I think, 1890s. And it didn't really catch on. The steam turbine, of course, did catch on, though, much later. And right up to the end of the age of the ocean liner, really,
Yeah.
they were using steam turbines.
Yeah.
Very efficient, much more efficient than triple expansion boiler and things like that.
Mhm. There's a question about the Sultana. Just do we recall what that was? Does anyone have a comment on that? The horrible disaster.
I can speak a little bit to the Sultana, and I see the question. Yeah, it was carrying hundreds of Union soldiers. I can't remember the actual number. I'm sure I could look it up quickly, but the Sultana was prior to the Civil War, it was, if you will, a regular steamboat operating, especially on the Ohio River, but also on the Mississippi River as well. And I've seen references to it during the war, carrying cargo. You didn't have a lot of passenger traffic during the American Civil War. And that's how it ended up being pressed into service to carry these Union soldiers at the end of the war. Many of them had been in prisoner of war camps. And so the Union's trying to get them from basically the South. It was outside of Memphis where the boat sank, or just right at Memphis, get them into a northern state. And the boat was horribly overcrowded. Thousands of people were on board, and basically the boat tilted because it was overloaded. And I believe there was the explosion, and then you had just men thrown into the water, many of whom couldn't swim, and then you had a number of civilians as well who were on small boats, and they were doing the best that they could to sort of fish these soldiers out of the water and bring them to the Memphis wharf.
1,169 deaths. It was the worst disaster in American maritime history.
And it was in the spring when the river was cold, so a lot of those soldiers probably didn't, very quickly. If they didn't drown directly, they hypothermia,
Right.
made sure that kind of finish the job.
Okay. All right. Thanks for looking that up. We did see that the sons and daughters do have presence online too, so that's something that we can all look into in the future too, if others have questions on that. Now, is there a way that you all can pull together sort of from a big picture the key figures and compare them? I know someone mentioned about the computer age and the automotive age, but is there a way this, say, 100-year period from the transition from sail to steam and then to where we are today can be summarized in a couple of sentences? It's asking a lot, but oftentimes people think of Robert Fulton and they say, he invented the steamboat, and obviously we all know that's not the case, but it's more like he's sort of the Henry Ford, I guess, in an automotive sense of bringing it to fruition and then more popularity. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer because, as Kevin was talking about, there was so much improvisation and adaptation to not individual, but sort of local circumstances. I will mention an individual who maybe doesn't get spoken about as much, Henry Shreve.
Oh, yeah, he was a great New Englander.
Yeah, yeah. He did not
Snagboat
invent.
man.
Yeah, he did not invent a steamboat, but there is a city named after him, Shreveport, Louisiana.
Yeah, yeah.
And what he did was to invent a snag boat. We didn't talk about it, but snags were a significant problem on the western rivers that sank a number of steamboats. And snags were trees that had been washed into the river and basically with their roots intact and sort of planted at the bottom of the river. Now they were spears more or less underwater. And so what Shreve did is he invented a boat more or less that was sort of like a catamaran, and it would butt up against these snags and snap them off, or and then he also had big cranes on his boat, and divers would go into the water and they'd wrap chains around the snags, and then they'd basically yank them out of the water, cut them up, and then they would float away. And in large part, the government contracted with him, and so he was in large part responsible for a safer travel experience on the western rivers, at least, because you had much fewer snags, and so now you were more likely to travel at night, and so travel was more quick, because you're not going to travel at night because of snags, before a lot of these snags are removed. But there was the famous Red River Raft, which was this natural dam of debris that had gotten into the Red River, and it was so strong and silted in that trees were growing out of it, and you could ride a horse across it. And so Shreve attacked this dam and was able to open it up and open up the Red River. And then what that did was to kind of make the land above the dam in northern Louisiana and above it into Oklahoma so much more valuable, because now steamboats could go up the Red River, and you have this massive influx of settlers and growth of cotton plantations and bringing in of enslaved people into northern Louisiana after this dam is opened up. And so I'd say Shreve is one of these individuals who maybe people have heard of, but don't really understand why he was important, at least on the western rivers.
I think there were also a whole bunch of magnates who aggregated and consolidated steamboat lines like Cornelius Vanderbilt. And then so many of them went into railroads because they had the resources and the background and the knowledge and the interest. But I would say in the post-steamboat era, but in the major shipping era, I'd want to say Malcolm McLean as more or less the inventor of the container. That's probably had more impact on modern shipping than any other innovation, with the possible exception of the double-hulled petroleum carriers, the big ULCCs and the VLCCs, caused by the wreck of the Exxon Valdez, which was a single-hull tanker up in Prince William Sound. But I would argue for Malcolm McLean personally. One of the things I'm having problems with, though, and I'd welcome any listeners to contribute, how do we collect today's maritime history for the future? I mean, we've got all of these shipwrecks and artifacts from the past and historical records, but what records are we going to have of today's maritime heritage? Everything is digital. We're not using photography anymore, film photography. If you try to blow up a digital image, it's going to pixelate. So it's very hard to get large pictures. You can't collect ultra-large crude carriers. How are we going to preserve today's maritime heritage for future generations?
That's an unbelievable question, even more difficult than the one I asked. I mean, we even have it, like you said earlier, the fact that it used to be young people and others, even older, were fascinated because you could see a working harbor, you could see ships, stevedores, things being moved. And now everything is far away and inside containers, like you say. So how do you make that really sexy, if you will, for the next generation? Well, we feel that it's a poignant question, and that it can't be answered yet, but it certainly needs to be addressed. Dr. Chrisman, do you have a comment on that?
I'm having a hard enough time struggling with early 19th century data collection, my own sites, and so I'm feel like I'm in the trenches, and it's hard to we do have all of us in this field have a responsibility to kind of pass on a strong state of scholarship, that we have generations continue to pursue the questions that we've been so fortunate in our lifetimes to be able to address, keeping the next generation involved, engaged in museums. And I know museums struggle these days with trying to find a good balance between keeping the physical space and the visitorship up, at the same time being part of the digital world, or the internet world. And so it's something kind of bigger picture in our field is keeping the public engaged, keeping new generation of scholars engaged, while at the same time kind of pursuing the things which are of interest to us, researching the shipwrecks, or the archives, and creating the information that hopefully will be of use to people generations from now.
And well, I think with that and just pondering this thought, it's not one that we'll be able to answer in just a few moments, but definitely in the next few weeks, months, and years, decades, perhaps, Paul, Kevin, and Robert. But I think we move forward, and thank you for everyone for joining us for this event from the National Association of Scholars. In a moment, we'll proceed to the closing remarks from our speakers. But before we do, I wanted to take a moment to say that if you enjoyed this webinar, there's several ways you can help the NAS continue to make them. The first is, if you're not already a member of NAS, then join. It really does help, and you will get special access to these and other events from the NAS. The second thing you can do, if you're already a member of the NAS, or if you simply want to go the extra mile, is to donate to the NAS. You'll find links in the chat below that will let you learn more. And the third thing you can do is share the videos of these events with others and tell them about them. With that, I'd like to now turn back in order to our speakers for a few closing remarks. Dr. Chrisman.
What we kind of touched on today here is a transportation revolution that we're still living through. This is what I tell my students, talking to them about steamboat studies, is that you're seeing the beginning of burning a carbon-based fuel to propel a vehicle forward, over the surface of the earth. In this case, it's water, but of course later that translates to land, with railroads, and subsequently to land with automobiles and trucks, and finally, to the air with airplanes. And we're part of a continuum here, and it gets going in the late 18th, early 19th century with the development of functional steamboats. And what we're seeing too is the struggle to kind of maintain a balance between in the early 19th century. They had the same problem we had, fighting over seatbelt use in the later part of the 20th century. Steamboats were exploding all the time. There was a public safety crisis, but nobody was prepared to give up steamboats. They were too, wonderful an invention, too useful. And as Robert and Paul have mentioned, they were able to accomplish so much and change society so profoundly that wasn't going to happen. And so you see this kind of push-pull between the various forces within society to try and utilize these to their greatest extent, to profit from them, to change the world on them and make them safer at the same time. I'm fascinated by the arguments by the people who were steamboat owners arguing against steamboat safety regulations because they said, we will do this ourselves. And yet the record year after year was it was not happening. And more steamboats were blowing up, and they would continue to blow up even with safety inspections instituted. So the beginning of federally funded research is based on finding out why steamboats explode. The federal dollars that flow to the American society and to American scholarship and to science today have their basis in studying how we can make these things safer. So I love this topic just because it encompasses a form of transportation that's interesting, but then it really goes out and covers everything you can think of: environment, society, technology, the human experience. It's all in the package with steamboats. And so I think we're all very lucky to have a chance to be studying some aspect of this or another. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I love this topic, and look forward to spending more time researching it over the next few years and decades.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gudmundsted.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And in a lot of ways, the study of steamboats embodies some of the best things about, when we study history in terms of there aren't simple answers. And the past is so complex and so nuanced that, to boil it down to just like a 1 or 2 word response to something is really difficult. And, when I first, I fell into the topic of steamboats as a research topic completely accidentally, and came in with a number of assumptions, part of which were sort of the romantic idea of steamboats, that they were these luxury forms of travel. Wealthy people would travel on the steamboats. You had, riverboat gamblers as well. And, what I found was, part of that's true, but then there's also this really interesting contradiction that steamboats were primarily carrying freight. So they're carrying freight and they're carrying wealthy people at the same time. They're not as romantic as you might think in the way that you're traveling. And, Kevin was talking about the possibility of explosions as well. And so they're, in some ways, I think steamboats capture the contradictions that are at the heart of the United States. This idea of progress, but also progress for whom, the idea of using technology, and there are great benefits to technology, but then there are also great costs to technology as well. Thinking about being able to control the environment, that's another question that steamboats raise, as did other forms of technology. So it's, you study it and you can get a great feel for kind of thinking about the past and how the past still informs our present.
Well said, Dr. G. Thank you so much. And now Dr. Johnston.
Boy, you guys didn't leave me much meat on the bone there. I feel like steamboats are a page in human heritage, and we've flipped a few pages beyond it, but they both shrank the world because they allowed sailing on schedules and trade and travel, communication, exploration. All of those things took place on the sea and in the waters, both the inland waterways as well as the oceans and the seas. So steamboats not only expanded our horizons, but they also shrank the world down by making everything faster, and they began accelerating all of the things that we're talking about: the trade, travel, communication, immigration, emigration, movement of people and goods and ideas all over the world. And that, to me, is what makes it so interesting, because it affected everything in our lives. And transportation today, and particularly maritime transportation, continues to affect our lives every single day in almost every way.
Right on. And of course, the most up-to-date, high-tech military vessels today are nuclear powered, but they're still driven by steam. So there's some relevance there connecting us. So I just want to thank our panelists. Thank you all for joining us today, and hope everyone has a